Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte Bronte, with steampunk additions by R.A. Harding. Read by Danita Feldman.
This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead or actual events is purely coincidental. Copyright 2021 by R.A. Harding. All rights reserved. This book or any portion thereof may not be reproduced or used in any manner whatsoever without the express written permission of the publisher, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. To request permissions, contact author at publicworkssteampunk@gmail.com. For Mom, who gifted me a love of reading and writing. Dear reader, I write this to you from a great height, a view of the world that Charlotte Bronte was unable to achieve, but dreamed about with her pen and paper. These first commercial flights to the moon in silken dirigibles have caused me to consider the world in which Charlotte wrote this novel. She did not know that many of these things would be possible, marvels such as automatons, floating manors, villages that could walk across the earth to find new places to work, and that each part of our earthly bodies are now interchangeable. I feel that she saw the beginnings of our Hindu-Christian religion, and understood that the gods in the heavens would join forces to save the souls and subsequent reincarnations of all those who are upon this earth. She was a woman of great insight and a sweeping imagination. It is in that spirit that I make these additions to this book. I hope that she would find it entertaining, but I am sure she would remind me that the only reason the book has been beloved long after her passing is due to the readers. Should you find the changes I have made offensive, then I would heartily advise you to throw it out with the rubbish. Perchance you read it. May it bring you a new way to enjoy this novel in a world that is both familiar and fantastical. With best wishes, R.A. Harding. Chapter 1, in which Jane reads a book and fights a cruel cousin. There was no possibility of taking a walk that day. We had been wandering, indeed, in the leafless shrubbery an hour in the morning, like clockwork toy mice who have been wound up and set to roll about aimlessly. But since dinner, the cold winter wind had brought with it clouds so sombre and a rain so penetrating that further outdoor exercise was now out of the question. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks around the edge of the estate, especially on chilly afternoons, though the house floated above us with the engines humming a grey cloud of warmth. It was not enough to keep us from coming home in the raw twilight with nipped fingers and toes and a heart saddened by the constant scolding of Bessie the nurse, and humbled by constant comparisons to my cousins Eliza, John, and Georgiana Reed. The said Eliza, John, and Georgiana were now clustered round their mamma in the drawing-room. She lay reclined on a sofa by the fireside, and with her darlings about her, for the time neither quarrelling nor crying, looked perfectly happy. Me she had barred from joining the group, saying she regretted to keep me at a distance, but that until she heard from Bessie and could see that I was honestly endeavouring to acquire a more sociable and childlike disposition, a more attractive and sprightly manner, she really must exclude me from privileges intended only for contented, happy little children. "What does Bessie say I have done?" I asked, as I nervously touched the winding gears beside my right eye. It was my habit, when in distress, to focus the glass eye in clockwork that gave me sight, as if by focusing my ocular mechanism I could also better understand her objections. "Jane, I don't like questioners. Besides, there is something truly forbidding in a child with your appearance taking up her elders in that manner. Be seated somewhere, and until you can speak pleasantly, remain silent." I left, knowing that I could never attain the more childlike disposition she desired, as I had neither the temperament nor ability to change my appearance. I looked as much like a child as any other, but for the delicate cogs and clockwork that gave me sight in my right eye, and the mechanisms visible on my face, which gave me, I suppose, a strange and forbidding aspect. A breakfast room adjoined the drawing room. I slipped in there. It contained a bookcase. I soon took a volume, taking care that it should be one with pictures. I climbed into the window seat. Gathering up my feet, I sat cross-legged, and having drawn the red moreen curtain in front of me, I was completely enclosed. Folds of scarlet drapery shut in my view to the breakfast room. To the left were the clear panes of glass, protecting but not separating me from the drear November day. At intervals, while turning over the pages of my book, I studied the aspect of that winter afternoon. Afar, it offered a pale blank of mist and cloud. Near, a scene of wet lawn and storm-beat shrub, with ceaseless rain sweeping away wildly. The automatons that tended the grounds stood motionless under the cover of the pavilion, but the rain that fell past them made them shimmer as if they were shivering in the pale light. I returned to my book, Bewick's History of British Birds. The content did not interest me, generally speaking, and yet there were certain introductory pages that, child as I was, I could not help but return to. The words in these introductory pages connected themselves with the succeeding small pictures and gave significance to the rock standing up alone in a sea of billow and spray, to the broken airship wilted and stranded on a desolate coast, to the cold and ghastly moon glancing through cloud at a wreck just sinking. Then came the image of the demon pinning down the thief's pack behind him. I passed over quickly. It was an object of terror, as was the black-horned thing seated aloof on a rock, surveying a distant crowd surrounding a gallows. Each picture told a story, mysterious often to my undeveloped understanding and imperfect feelings, yet profoundly interesting as the tales Bessie sometimes told on winter evenings when she chanced to be in a good humour, and when, having brought her ironing table to the nursery hearth, she allowed us to sit about it, and while she sewed Mrs. Reed's lace frills and crimped her nightcap borders, fed our eager attention with her tales of love and adventure, taken from old fairy tales and other ballads. We revelled in her tales of the Clockwork Prince, the 9 lives of the pirate cat, and the untethered kingdom of Ballyamon. With the book on my knee, I was then happy at least in my way. I feared nothing but interruption, and that came too soon. The breakfast-room door opened. "Poor Madam Mope!" cried the whining and nasal voice of John Reed. Then he paused. As I was enclosed in the window seat, he found the room apparently empty. "Where the dickens is she?" he continued. "Lizzie, Georgie, Jane is not here. Tell Mamma she has run out into the rain, the bad animal." It is well I drew the curtain, thought I, and I wished fervently he might not discover my hiding place. Nor would John have found it out himself. He was not quick either of vision or conception. But Eliza just put her head in at the door and said at once, "She's in the window seat, to be sure." And I scrambled out immediately, for I trembled at the idea of being dragged forth by John. "What do you want?" I asked with awkward diffidence. "Say, what do you want, Master Reed?" was the answer. "I want you to come here." And seating himself in an armchair, he gestured that I was to approach and stand before him. John Reed was a schoolboy of 14 years old, 4 years older than I. He was large and stout for his age, with a dingy and unwholesome skin, heavy limbs and large extremities. He gorged himself habitually at table, which made him fat, and gave him a dim eye and flabby cheeks. He ought now to have been at school, but his mamma had taken him home for a month or two on account of his delicate health. Mr. Miles, the schoolmaster, affirmed that he would do very well if he had fewer cakes and sweets sent from home. But Mrs. Reed's heart turned from an opinion so harsh, and inclined rather that John's sallowness was owing to over-application, and perhaps to pining after home. John had not much affection for his mother and sisters, and an antipathy to me. He bullied and punished me, not 2 or 3 times in the week, nor once or twice in the day, but continually. Every nerve I had feared him, and it felt that my bones shrank when he came near. There were moments when I was overwhelmed by the terror he inspired, because I had no defence whatever against either his words or his blows. The servants did not like to offend their young master by siding with me against him, and Mrs. Reed was blind and deaf on the subject. She never saw him strike or heard him abuse me, though he did both occasionally in her very presence. More frequently, however, behind her back. Habitually obedient to John, I came up to his chair. He spent some 3 minutes in thrusting out his tongue at me as far as he could without damaging the roots. I knew he would soon strike, and while dreading the blow, I mused on the disgusting and ugly appearance of him who would presently deal it. I did not need to adjust my ocular mechanism to notice the pallid, stretched skin and irregular patches that showed on his face from the simple effort of walking from one room to the next. I thought to myself that he did not need to try to make disgusting faces when his normal look was always so disagreeable. I wonder if he read that notion in my face, for all at once, without speaking, he struck suddenly and strongly with his right hand across my face. I tottered, my eye losing its focus for a moment, hearing the tick of the gears frantically clicking in my head, trying to focus my vision, and on regaining my equilibrium took a step or 2 away from his chair. "That is for your impudence in talking back to mamma," said he, "and for your sneaking way behind curtains, and for the look you had in your eyes a minute ago, you Cyclops." Accustomed to John Reed's abuse, I never had a thought of replying to it. My thought was only how to endure the second blow which would certainly follow the insult. "What were you doing behind the curtain?" he asked. "I was reading." "Show the book." I returned to the window and fetched it thence. "You have no business to take our books. You are a dependent, mamma says. You have no money. Your father left you none. You ought to beg and not to live here with gentlemen's children like us and eat the same meals we do and wear clothes at our mamma's expense." He paused to catch his breath, and a dark idea showed on his features. "Now I'll teach you to rummage my bookshelves, for they are mine. All the house belongs to me, or will in a few years. Go and stand by the door, out of the way of the mirror and the windows." I did so, not at first aware of his intention, but when I saw him lift the book and stand to hurl it, I instinctively flung myself aside with a cry of alarm. Not soon enough, however. The book was flung, it hit me, and I fell, striking my head against the door and cutting it. The cut bled, the pain was sharp. Again I was dizzy, and my hand flew to the gears at the side of my face to still the spinning and clicking gears that had been thrown out of equilibrium by the jolt against the ground. I felt blood on my hand, and as my terror passed its peak, swiftly other feelings replaced them. "Wicked and cruel boy," I said, "you are like a murderer. You are like a wicked slaver. You are like the Roman emperors." I had read much of the classic rulers, had formed opinions, and indeed drawn parallels between their unjust ways and John, which I had never before declared aloud. What, he cried. "Did she say that to me? Did you hear her, Eliza and Georgiana? Won't I tell mamma? But first—" He ran headlong at me. I felt him grasp my hair and my shoulder, but I was in a desperate and angry state. I really saw in him a tyrant, a murderer. I felt a drop or 2 of blood from my head trickle down my neck. My eye was still spinning, and I was aware of my somewhat sharp suffering. These sensations for a moment overrode my habitual fear of him, and I met him with all anger in responding blows. I don't very well know what I did with my hands, but he called me rat, rat, and bellowed out in fearful surprise. He did not suffer at my hands long, for Eliza and Georgiana had run for Mrs. Reed, who had gone upstairs. She now came upon the scene, followed by Bessie and her maid Abbot. We were parted. I heard the words, "Dear, dear, what a fury to fly at Master John! Did you ever see anybody in such a picture of passion?" Then Mrs. Reed commanded, "Take her away to the Red Room and lock her in there." 4 hands were immediately laid upon me, and I was borne upstairs. Chapter 2, in which Jane is imprisoned in the Red Room. I resisted all the way, kicking and crying, a new thing for me, which greatly strengthened the bad opinion Bessie and Miss Abbot had of me. The fact is, I was a trifle beside myself. I was conscious that a moment's mutiny had resulted in strange and hard penalties, and like any other rebel slave, I felt resolved in my desperation to go all lengths to resist. "Hold her arms, Miss Abbot, she's like a mad cat. She's mad enough to be sent to Bridewell." "Not even that madhouse could keep a child like this. For shame, cried the lady's maid. "What shocking conduct, Miss Eyre, to strike a young gentleman, your benefactress's son, your young master." "Master? How is he my master? Am I a servant? Am I an automaton at his beck and call?" "No, you are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep. And you are less than an automaton, for you speak when you have been told to be silent. There, sit down and think over your wickedness." They had got me by this time into the apartment indicated by Mrs. Reed, and had thrust me upon a stool. My impulse was to rise from it like a spring. Their 2 pair of hands arrested me instantly. "If you don't sit still, you must be tied down," said Bessie. "Miss Abbot, lend me your garters. She would break mine directly." Miss Abbot turned to divest a stout leg of her considerable garters. This preparation for bonds, and the additional humiliation it inferred, took a little of the excitement out of me. "Don't take them off," I cried. "I will not stir." To show I was earnest in this promise, I grasped the seat with both hands. "Mind you don't," said Bessie, and when she saw that I was really subsiding, she loosened her hold of me. Then she and Miss Abbot stood with folded arms, looking darkly and doubtfully on my face, as incredulous of my sanity. "She never did so before," at last said Bessie, turning to Abbot. "But it was always in her," was the reply. "I've told Mrs. often my opinion about the child, and Mrs. agreed with me. She's a patchwork, underhand little thing. I never saw a girl of her age with so much deceit." Bessie did not respond, but after a moment's pause she turned to me and said, "You ought to be aware, miss, that you are under obligations to Mrs. Reed. She keeps you. If she were to turn you out, you would have to go to the poorhouse, or worse, to the streets." I had nothing to say to these words, as they were not new to me. My very first memories included hints of the same kind. This reproach of my dependence had become a vague sing-song in my ear, very painful and crushing, but only half heard any more. Miss Abbot joined in. "And you ought not to think yourself on an equality with the Mrs. Reed and Master Reed, because Mrs. kindly allows you to be brought up with them. They will have a great deal of money, this floating manor, the estate and lands around, and you will have none. It is your place to be humble and to try to make yourself agreeable to them." "What we tell you is for your good," added Bessie in a kind voice. "You should try to be useful and pleasant. Then perhaps you would have a home here. But if you become passionate and rude, Mrs. will send you away, I am sure." "Besides," said Miss Abbot, regarding me but speaking to Bessie, "the gods will punish her. They might strike her dead in the midst of her tantrums, and then where would she go, and to what horrible life would she reincarnate to? Come, Bessie, we will leave her. I wouldn't have her heart for anything." Then turning on me, she said firmly, "Say your prayers and your mantras, Miss Eyre, when you are by yourself, for if you don't repent, some bad spirit might be permitted to come down the chimney and fetch you away." They went, shutting the door and locking it behind them. The Red Room was a square chamber, very seldom slept in except when there were by chance too many visitors at Gateshead Hall, making it necessary to use the room. Yet it was one of the largest and stateliest chambers in the mansion. A bed supported on massive pillars of mahogany, hung with curtains of deep red damask, stood in the centre. The two large windows, with their blinds always drawn down, were half shrouded in layers of similar drapery. The carpet was red. The table at the foot of the bed was covered with a crimson cloth. The wardrobe, the toilet table, the chairs were of darkly polished old mahogany. Out of these deep surrounding shades rose high and glared white the piled-up mattresses and pillows of the bed, spread with a snowy Marseille counterpane. The other large piece of furniture was an ample cushioned easy chair near the head of the bed, also white, with a footstool before it, and looking, I thought, like a pale throne. This room was chill because it seldom had a fire. It was silent because it was far from the nursery and kitchen, solemn because it was so seldom entered. The automaton housemaid alone came here on Saturdays to wipe from the mirrors and the furniture a week's quiet dust. And Mrs. Reed herself less often visited it to review the contents of a certain secret drawer in the wardrobe, where were stored parchments, her jewel casket, and a miniature of her deceased husband, who was the source of the spell which kept the Red Room so lonely in spite of its grandeur. Mr. Reed had been dead 9 years. It was in this room he deteriorated as doctors attached machines to prolong his suffering until he breathed his last. Here he lay in state. From this place he was borne by the undertaker's men to the pyre to be cleansed in smoke. And since that day, a sense of dreary consecration had guarded it from frequent intrusion. My seat, to which Bessie and the bitter Miss Abbott had left me riveted, was a low ottoman near the marble chimney-piece. The bed rose before me. To my right hand there was the high dark wardrobe. To my left were the curtained windows, and a great looking-glass between them repeated the vacant majesty of the bed and room. I was not quite sure whether they had locked the door, and when I dared move, I got up and went to see. Alas, yes, no jail was ever more secure. Returning, I had to cross before the looking-glass. My fascinated glance involuntarily explored the picture it revealed. All looked colder and darker in the mirror than in reality, and the strange little figure there gazing at me with a white face and arms specking the gloom. I stepped closer to see a rare reflection of my own face, and examined that which made many look at me askance. My face was white and plain, but for a dull shimmer coming from the delicate cogs moving slowly on my upper right temple. The very wheels that controlled and focused my false eye at my unconscious mind's whim moved with a light tick that could be heard in the silence. The glass eye itself seeming to be made of magic and allowed me to see every detail despite the gloom of this dark room. This clockwork eye could, with great clarity, focus on the intricate pattern and stitching on the bedspread. In the little bit of light that filtered through the heavy curtains, I could see the very dust motes that, being agitated by my movements, swirled through the air as if responding to my own inner tumult. My hair was dishevelled from the scuffle, and I smoothed the strands along my right temple back into the tight pins to prevent them from falling in the slowly moving ocular gears. The experience of my hair and apparatus getting caught and twisted, rendering me sightless in one eye and helpless until someone, usually Bessie, would help untangle the two and set my eye in motion again, had motivated me greatly to keep my hair orderly at a young age. In the mirror, my glittering eyes of fear moved where all else was still, and had the effect of a real spirit. I thought I looked like one of the phantoms, half fairy, half imp, that Bessie's evening stories represented as coming out of lone ferny dells in moors and appearing before the eyes of travellers, caused only mischief and sorrow. I returned to my stool. Superstition was with me at that moment, but I was not completely afraid, for my blood was still warm. The mood of my rebellion was still bracing me with its bitter vigour, and I lapsed into a deep reverie of thought. All John Reed's violent tyrannies, all his sister's proud indifference, all his mother's aversion, all the servants' partiality rose in my disturbed mind. Why was I always suffering, always browbeaten, always accused, forever condemned? Why could I never please? Why was it useless to try to win anyone's favour? Eliza, who was headstrong and selfish, was respected. Georgiana, who had a spoiled temper, was universally indulged. Her beauty, her pink cheeks and golden curls seemed to delight all who looked at her, and to purchase indemnity for every fault. John no one thwarted, much less punished, though he twisted the necks of the pigeons, killed the little pea-chicks, set the dogs at the sheep, stripped the hothouse vines of their fruit, broke the buds of the choicest plants in the conservatory, tripped the automaton servants and laughed as they struggled to rise, and spit off the edge of the manor on hapless shepherds and servants below. He called his mother old girl, bluntly disregarded her wishes, not unfrequently tore and spoiled her silk attire, and he was still her own darling. I dared commit no fault. I strove to fulfil every duty, and I was labelled naughty and tiresome, sullen and sneaking from morning to noon and from noon to night. My head still ached and bled with the blow and fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me. Yet because I had turned against him to defend myself, I was loaded with general criticism. Unjust, unjust, said my reason, and resolve rose, looking to achieve escape from insufferable oppression as running away, or if that could not be effected, never eating or drinking more and letting myself die. What a distress of soul was mine that dreary afternoon, how all my brain was in tumult and all my heart in insurrection. Yet in what darkness, what dense ignorance was the mental battle fought. I could not answer the ceaseless inward question, why I thus suffered. Now at the distance of many years, I see it clearly. I was a discord in Gateshead Hall. I was like nobody there. I had nothing in harmony with Mrs. Reed or her children. They did not love me. In fact, as little did I love them. They were not required to regard with affection a thing that they could not sympathise with, opposed to them in temperament, a useless thing, incapable of serving their interest or adding to their pleasure, a noxious thing that responded with indignation at their treatment, of contempt of their judgment. I know that had I been a sanguine, brilliant, careless, exacting, handsome, romping child, though equally dependent and friendless, Mrs. Reed would have endured my presence more pleasantly. Her children would have treated me as more of a playmate. The servants would have been less prone to make me the scapegoat of the nursery. Daylight began to forsake the Red Room. It was past 4 o'clock, and the beclouded afternoon was tending to twilight. I heard the rain still beating continuously on the staircase window, the lower vibrations as the hall lowered to rest upon the pylons as it did nightly, and the wind howling in the grove beneath. I grew by degrees cold as a stone, and then my courage sank. My habitual mood of humiliation, self-doubt, forlorn depression fell damp on the embers of my ebbing anger. Every person I knew said I was wicked, and perhaps I might be so, for hadn't I just entertained the thought of starving myself to death? That certainly was a crime. And was I fit to die? Or was the vault under the shrine of Gateshead Church an inviting destination? In such vault, I had been told, did Mr. Reed lie buried instead of cremated as was custom, and led by this thought to recall him, I dwelt on it with gathering dread. I could not remember him, but I knew that he was my own uncle, my mother's brother, that he had taken me when a parentless injured infant to his house, and that in his last moments he had required a promise of Mrs. Reed that she would care and keep me as one of her own children. Mrs. Reed probably considered that she had kept this promise, and so she had, I dare say, as well as her nature would permit her. But how could she really like a child unconnected with her after her husband's death by any tie? It must have been most irksome to find herself bound by a hard-run pledge to stand in the stead of a parent to a strange child she could not love, and to see an uncongenial alien permanently intruded on her own family group. A singular notion dawned upon me. I doubted not, never doubted, that if Mr. Reed had been alive, he would have treated me kindly, and now, as I sat looking at the white bed and darkening walls, occasionally also turning a fascinated eye towards the dimly gleaming mirror, I began to recall what I had heard of dead men troubled by the breaking of their last wishes, revisiting the earth before reincarnating to punish the guilty and avenge the oppressed. And I thought Mr. Reed's spirit, still bound to the earth and not yet passed on to another life, harassed by the wrongs of his sister's child, might leave his spirit wandering and rise before me in this room. I wiped my tears and hushed my sobs, fearful that any sign of violent grief might waken his spirit's voice to comfort me, or elicit from the gloom some haloed face bending over me with strange pity. This idea, which might have been meant to comfort me, I felt would be terrifying to see. With all my might I endeavoured to calm. I reached into my pocket and with trembling fingers retrieved my prayer beads, which rattled a little as I began to say my mantras to Lord Krishna and Lord Jesus. Shaking my hair from my eyes, I lifted my head and tried to look boldly round the dark room. At this moment a light gleamed on the wall. The gears on my eye ticked rapidly as the aperture focused quickly in and out, making the room seem big and far away at the same moment. Was it, I asked myself, a ray from the moon penetrating some gap in the curtains? No, moonlight was still, and this moved. While I gazed, it glided up to the ceiling and quivered over my head. I can now guess readily that this streak of light was, in all likelihood, a gleam from a lantern carried by someone across the lawn. But then, prepared as my mind was for horror, shaken as my nerves were by agitation, I thought the swift darting beam was a sign of some coming vision from another world. My heart beat thick, my head grew hot. A sound filled my ears which I deemed the rushing of wings. Something seemed near me. I was oppressed, suffocated, endurance broke down. I rushed to the door and screamed with all the fear that filled my body and shook the lock in desperate effort. Steps came running along the outer passage. The key turned. Bessie and Abbot entered. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" said Bessie. "What a dreadful noise! It went right through me," exclaimed Abbot. "Take me out! Let me go into the nursery," was my cry. "What for? Are you hurt? Have you seen something?" again demanded Bessie. "Oh, I saw a light, and I thought a ghost would come." I had now got hold of Bessie's hand, and she did not snatch it from me. "She has screamed out on purpose," declared Abbot in some disgust. "And what a scream! If she had been in great pain, one would have excused it, but she only wanted to bring us all here. I know her naughty tricks." "What is all this?" demanded another voice peremptorily, and Mrs. Reed came along the corridor, her cap flying wide, her gown rustling stormily. "Abbot and Bessie, I believe I gave orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room till I came to her myself." "Miss Jane screamed so loud, ma'am," pleaded Bessie. "Let her go," was the only answer. "Loose Bessie's hand, child. You cannot succeed in getting out by these means. Be assured I abhor deceit, particularly in children. It is my duty to show you that tricks will not work. You will now stay here an hour longer, and it is only on condition of perfect submission and stillness that I shall let you out then." "Oh, aunt, have pity, forgive me. I cannot endure it. Let me be punished some other way. I shall be killed if—" "Silence! This violence is almost repulsive, and so no doubt she felt it. I was a precocious actress in her eyes. She sincerely looked on me as a passionate, mean-spirited and deceitful child." Bessie and Abbot having retreated, Mrs. Reed, impatient of my now frantic anguish and wild sobs, abruptly thrust me back in the room and locked me in without farther parley. I heard her sweeping away, and soon after she was gone, I suppose I had a type of fit. Unconsciousness closed the scene.
Thank you for listening to these chapters of Public Works Steampunk presents Jane Eyre. This book is copyright 2021 by R.A. Harding. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and subscribe so you will be notified when the next chapters are available. The Music Box intro and outro was recorded by Nicholas Drewski. If you would like to read the author's notes on this chapter or order the book, please go to publicworkssteampunk.com, and while you're there, join the mailing list to get a one-of-a-kind infographic about the book and more. Farewell for the present.